Hello, and today on Beatles Books, I am very pleased to be joined by author, broadcaster, and journalist Lesley-Ann Jones. Welcome, Lesley-Ann.
Thank you very much. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks.
And today we're going to be talking about your latest book, Fly Away, Paul. Interesting title to the book. It's not often that you see a book drawing on an 18th century nursery rhyme as a title. So, how were you inspired to title the book in this way?
It's a funny thing about titles, they come to me. Uh, they just occur to me. The muse must be out there somewhere. And I was trying to think of something that would convey Paul's departure from the Beatles and his decade with Wings and his transformation into a solo superstar. And just flying away wings, it just kind of crystallized in my head
Perfect.
one day. He's flying away from the Beatles because he's in Wings. He is Wings. And then Wings was the training ground, is my opinion, for him becoming a solo artist. People have said, why didn't he just become a solo artist straight off when the Beatles broke up? He kind of did, because he recorded a solo album, pretty much all of it by himself, uh, which was McCartney, or what they nowadays refer to as McCartney 1. But he clearly wasn't ready for that yet. And Linda had already identified that he needed another band. And the name Wings came much later. He was waiting the birth of his second daughter with Linda, Stella, in a hospital in Southeast London, and it was an emergency cesarean section, and mother and baby were both at risk. And Paul, he said for the second time in his life, he had a visitation. The first time being um, when his mother, Mary, appeared to him and said that everything would be okay and that he should just let it be, which became the inspiration for that song. And then he had a sort of a vision or a dream, he couldn't really explain it, nobody can, of beautiful white angelic wings in the hospital. And he realized Wings, that has to be the name of my new band. And so just that flying away connotation, leaving one thing and flying through something else to become something else again, it just seemed to encapsulate it. Um, and I love a nursery rhyme anyway.
Very, very clever. Of course, in the US, the nursery rhyme is better known as Two Little Blackbirds, which also fits in quite nicely with the period that you're covering.
It sort of does, yeah. It's I've got the little, or the English version of the nursery rhyme anyway, printed at the front of the book. So for anybody who didn't know or didn't hear it, it's right there.
The thing I like about your work is you always manage to find a different perspective to approach the subject. What guided you through this one?
My love for Linda, really. I was at one point working on a book with her. We'd met at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital when I was pregnant with my first child. And I'd been sent there by the Daily Mail to cover the opening of a new wing for terminally sick children. And Linda was a patron of Great Ormond Street. And so all the journalists were down there. We were all stationed behind a velvet rope. They have a hook on either end, and you're sort of
Mhm.
penned in like cattle. And I'm in the front because I was very hugely pregnant at the time. Imagine that news editor now trying to send a pregnant a news reporter on a job like that. I mean, no, it wouldn't happen, but it did happen. And she came in and she spotted me. You couldn't really miss me. And in a blink, she walked over, lifted up the velvet rope, took me by the hand, and she said, "You're coming with me." And
Fantastic.
we walked around the wards together. She held my hand and we shared a tissue at one point, and it was a very emotional experience. At the end of which there was lunch, and after that she said, "Please keep in touch. Let me know what you have. I'd love to hear how it went," and so on. And so I did. I let her know. And then over the years, she had the cookery books coming out, and each time they had a launch, a couple of them were at the Hard Rock Cafe in Piccadilly, and she would send me an invitation, and then she would send me the books, and always in the front of the book she would write, "To Lesley-Ann and lovely Mia, as she called my daughter, stay veggie, exclamation mark, lots of love, Linda, with lots of hearts drawn all over the place, which is a habit I picked up on. I tend to draw little hearts in everything I write, cards and Christmas cards and things like that. And we got to talking one day about her life story because she'd had quite an incredible life. She came from money. She's obviously born upstate New York. Um, her father was an influential person and she had a privileged childhood, except that her mother was killed in a plane crash when she was quite young. And that was a horribly traumatic thing to go through, but it was something that linked her with Paul, who'd lost his own mother when he was 14. So they had that in common. People who lose their moms are always searching for something. John obviously had lost his mother as well. It was only much later that it occurred to me that, so when Paul and John met on the 6th of July, 1957, this was only a few months after Paul had lost his mother, which was on the 31st of October 1956. Then they meet in the summer of 57. Then in the summer of 58, 15th of July, John's mother was tragically knocked down and killed outside his Auntie Mimi's house. And thereafter, he had to draw the bedroom curtains every morning on the spot on the road where his mom died. It's a horrific scenario when you think about it. But those two boys met more or less exactly between the death of their two mothers. And obviously, they didn't know at the time they met. But with hindsight, looking back on that, that was hugely significant. And then for Paul to also meet Linda, who'd lost her own mother, this was something that brought them together. And you get to thinking about these things. And Linda and I had a few meetings. I went down to the house in Peasmarsh and we mapped out a possible book. My way into that with her was yet again, I came up with a title that she loved. Her book was going to be called Mac the Wife. And she kind of fell for that. Oh yeah, that's exactly what it is. My life as a Beatle wife was the subtitle. And only she could tell that story. People have said to me so many times since then, why didn't you just write it? Why didn't you just write and publish that book? Well, of course I couldn't, because it was Linda's story and it had to be in her words, her memories, and it had to be me as the conduit taking the stories from her and recounting them. I couldn't do that without her input. So the story went to the grave with her.
How far into the project did you actually get?
Well, we planned it. We planned it all out, divided it to about 30 chapters.
Mm-hmm.
And so the content was all assigned. And it was just a question then of doing the interviews and then creating the chapters out of those interviews. So, we were in the early stages, they're still in the planning stages, certainly not anywhere near writing anything. But we'd committed to it and there was a plan. But then the story was that Paul decided he didn't want her to do this. And she always deferred to him. She was very deeply in love with him as he was with her, but he was the boss. Maybe this had something to do with the time that we're talking about. Maybe she would have challenged him more were that happening now, but it happened then during the 1980s, and that's actually rather a long time ago.
Did you approach Paul with regards to Fly Away, Paul?
No, I didn't, because not only had he done the lyrics, his book, which is as close as to an autobiography that you're going to get with him, and he's very committed to that. But also I wanted this to be my interpretation of his story. You do find when you're writing about very famous subjects that if you try to involve them in some way, it becomes a scenario of control and you lose your autonomy. My approach with the books I write tends to be that I will go looking for peripheral people who were very involved with the subject at different times in their life, who could enlighten me on the trains of thought that I have been developing. If you try to involve the principal, they will want copy approval. They want you to sign NDAs. They want
Hmm.
control, absolute control. And they also want to benefit from it financially. I'm not saying Paul would have done, he doesn't need that kind of money, but um, a lot of times they do want that. And so you find that my analogy here is a strange one, but I would find that I was trying to write the book with my hands tied behind my back because other people would be driving the project. And I'm at a stage in my career where I want to have my own voice heard on these subjects, and I want to express my own opinions with the help, with a little help from my friends, with people who were there, who were involved, who knew them, and who can help me shape that story into the way I want to tell it.
You're clearly a fan, not just Paul, but of many of the subjects that you've written for, if not all of them. How easy is it to write objectively about someone that you respect and admire so much?
It is easy for me. I can stand back, and I thank my journalistic training for that as well. You always have to be objective, and you always have to see the bigger picture and to set things in context, and to be able to see, also to be able to see the story from other people's points of view as well. There's a thing about truth as well. I always remind myself of this, but there are three sides to every story, which is his, hers, and the truth. So
Mhm.
the actual truth of the matter lies somewhere between both extreme sides. And I'm always very mindful of that, to be balanced and to seek equilibrium and to try and show all sides of what happened. Recollections do differ, as Her Majesty famously said. Um, it's important to try and show all of it and to remain impartial. Although there always are, points at which one's own passion as a writer for the subject, for the eras, for the music, for what happened, especially in a story like this, it will be appropriate because Paul McCartney, especially, and the Beatles, secondly, have been, it's an old cliche, but they have been the soundtrack of my life.
Denny Lane's story is the most interesting, isn't it? Because after John, Denny would have been Paul's longest songwriting partner. Yet Denny's story is he joined the band in very much poverty-stricken circumstances, and sometimes he would drop the mask and he would say what he really felt, but a lot of the time he had to bite his tongue, one feels, because this was essentially a meal ticket for Denny and an opportunity that he didn't want to miss. How do you find Denny's role in the story, and what's your take on Denny Lane?
Well, you're right. It did become a meal ticket. He was down and out pretty much when he got the call from Paul. He was sleeping on a mattress in his manager's back office. He didn't have a roof over his head. He was between bands, and there was history there. They'd known each other in the past during the 60s. Danny was in the Moody Blues. Um, their paths had crossed. They'd been sort of friends. And Denny had a distinctive voice, a vocal, and also was a very strong guitarist. And Paul was kicking around, wondering who he could get, wondering who he could play with next. I believe it was never the intention that Denny was intended to replace John Lennon in any way. Paul never saw Denny as an equal. Denny saw Denny as an equal. And Denny didn't like the idea of being a hired hand, which is essentially what he was. Um, People will say, well, what about Band on the Run? When all the other musicians ran away and dropped the minute at the last second, the band was reduced. Well, you can't say reduced about Paul McCartney, can you? But it was down to Paul, Linda, and Denny. That was the band, and they made the whole of Band on the Run just them. So that is a band. I still don't see it as that. I still feel that Wings was Paul and Linda McCartney. Denny was the next layer down. And then it was a sort of revolving roundabout of different musicians, various drummers, various guitarists who came in at different times, which was great because it gave each of the albums a slightly different sound and a different thrust a different viewpoint. I think because Denny was there for the whole duration, for the whole 7 albums, right until 1980 when it all fell apart after Paul was arrested, that he'd built his part up in his mind. He was still a hired hand. He was on some royalties towards the end. He felt he'd had to fight for that. He was very resentful. I got to know Denny about 15 years ago through a band who I know who were a tribute act for the Traveling Wilburys. They're called the Trembling Wilburys, and they did a series of, they're still going, they did a series of gigs at a place in London called the Cricketers on a Friday. And one evening, Denny came along with his daughter, Heidi Jo Hines, and he got up with the pre-Trembling Wilburys, as they were then, because they hadn't quite decided to be that yet. And he got up and performed with them, and we all went back to his place. He still has the same flat in St John's Wood, and we all went back there, and we did all hang out for a bit. And he was still banging on about the fact that he hadn't been paid enough money by Paul McCartney. And of course, there was that famous faux pas when he actually said, well, he thought he was being interviewed for a book, and he gave extensive interviews to this person who then sold all of the material to a national newspaper and dropped him in it. That was his story. Paul and Linda, quite rightly, dropped him like a stone at that point. I think relations were restored later on, and I think while Paul does hold a grudge, and there are various examples I could give, but which I won't right here, I don't believe that he holds a grudge against Denny. Denny also liked to say that he and Paul co-wrote Mull of Kintyre. I think he made some contributions, but my understanding is that that was Paul's song, and it had been some years in the making as well. It wasn't something that they came up with together. So although his role is important, and it wouldn't, to us now, talking about it in hindsight, it wouldn't be Wings without Denny Laine, would it? But I think it could have easily been someone else.
Well, Paul did credit Denny on Mull of Kintyre, which remains the biggest selling non-charity single in the UK, certainly. And he did help out Denny later on when Denny fell on hard times. But he did end up with Denny's publishing, so he did end up with all of the publishing for the McCartney Lane catalogue after that. But
yeah, it's complicated.
He?
It's complicated. I think resentment is the word in Denny's life, really. Yeah, he was making great money at one point, but he's also splashing it around, and wasn't careful with it and ended up bankrupt. And Paul didn't.
Who was the most illuminating source of the people that you interviewed for Fly Away, Paul?
I think that would have to be the Scottish contingent. So when I was very first casting around for sources of material, people who were close to Paul and Linda, I was talking to a friend of mine called Jill Jackson, who's a musician from Glasgow. And I said, I'm needing to find somebody who knows the Kintyre Peninsula very well, who can start me off. She said, I know just the guy. I said, who's that? She said, my keyboard player. He grew up there, a guy called Johnny McKinnon. So I had an encounter with Johnny McKinnon, which led to extensive interviewing. And Johnny was able to talk me through the entire Wings history on Kintyre. He was 8 years old when when Paul and Linda first arrived. And then, of course, it became the sort of Wings base for a while. They had the Lower Ranacan studio up there on High Park Farm. And so much of Paul and Linda's material was recorded there. And so Johnny was the start, really. I've got a guy called Ed Phillips, who's a man Friday for me. If I go on these long distance research trips, he drives me, or he'll book the flights, he'll sort out the hotels, all that kind of stuff. And between us, we found 2 of the pipers on Mull of Kintyre. One, a guy called John Brown, and the other, Ian McCarroll. They were 16 years old when they performed, they recorded Mull of Kintyre in their full piper's regalia. And they're also famously in the video on Saddle Bay Beach, with a little castle in the background, and they're parading along the beach, and it's just so moving. And I went with Ed to Campbellton, where they live, which is a heck of a journey, I've got to say. You fly to Glasgow and then you basically drive 150 miles, and it was November and the rain was gushing down and it was black, and we were on the precipice of the lochs as we made our way down the peninsula, and fairly terrifying. Much easier to fly to Campbellton actually, but we wanted the full thrust of the experience. Went to see these guys, John and Ian, and spent considerable time with them. And they were fantastic. They could remember everything. Their memories were crystal clear. It was as though it had happened last week.
And of course, when you were working on the Map the Wife project with Linda, you actually visited Hyde Park Farm.
No, not as far back as then.
Ah,
no,
in the 80s.
No, my first visit was actually last November.
Oh, right. Okay.
I'd visited the other farm, which is in Peasmarsh, with Linda.
Ah, okay, that's why I mix it. That's the one that's got the Van Gogh, the mess painting in the kitchen, is it?
Yeah, leaning up against the wall. Yeah, that
Yes.
was. I know. It's a very surprising juxtapositions in that house. Yeah, but no, I hadn't been to Hyde Park Farm before. But that was an astonishing experience to just to wander that landscape, to soak it up the way they did. And I cast myself back to that very first trip that Paul and Linda took up there and imagined them getting away from the circus that was the Beatles. It was impossible to think myself into what that must have been like for those 420-something boys to have gone from being provincial lads from Liverpool with nothing. And yes, Hamburg was a big jump for them, where they did their so-called 10,000 hours and so on. But to even go from that, a German port, to the whole world is your stage, and suddenly your life is not your own. You go from an aircraft to a limo to a hotel to a sound check to a meal to giving the gig, which in those days they were only performing about 20 minutes at a time, and then back onto the plane and then onto the next place, and other people making all your decisions for you. I never even had to go out and buy a bag of groceries nor a Christmas tree. And suddenly you're in Scotland, where everywhere you look there are Christmas trees, and you can just go in the garden and hack one down and bring it in. It was all so extreme and different. And I remember standing in that landscape and trying to see what Linda saw the first time he took her there, which was nothing. This is just the most beautiful place she'd ever been in her life, because it was nowhere and it was nothing. And nobody would find them, or a couple of people tried, and those are other stories. But the people of Campbelltown let them in. They let them be. They didn't bother them. They referred to Paul as the Beatle, or the Beatles in. And if he popped down in Helen Wheels, his Land Rover, to the Chinese, the word would go out around the town, the McCartneys are having a takeaway. But that was about as intrusive as it got. They were just allowed to be there and to restore themselves and to nurture their family. And that was huge for Paul and Linda at that time.
So winding forward to the very end of Wings, and I interviewed Lawrence Cuba a few weeks back, and Lawrence was standing by Paul when he got arrested at Narita Airport. What's your whole take on why that happened?
Paul
Psychologically,
has,
whatever, what was going on in the background?
Paul has said it's possible that he sabotaged himself. As wild and extreme as that sounds, I think there might be something in that. They were tired at that point. They committed to this big tour in Japan, but they weren't really very well rehearsed. They weren't that prepared for it. Linda was wiped out. She just wanted to be at home with the kids and take them to school and feed them and be at home, be in one place for a change. She wasn't really up for yet another tour. And Paul puts a massive bag of hash in the top of his own suitcase, which he packed himself. I think it's highly likely he knew that his bag would be searched. He was taking a massive risk. It was very naive of him. And he and Linda then spent the only 11 nights of their marriage apart because he was in prison. And of course, Denny Lane was furious because he needed the money and he was banking on the earnings from this tour. After it was all over, Paul had to pay off the promoter. I think that cost him about $10 million, I should say. And they lost a lot of money, a lot of face. But the Japanese, it was a curious twist. The Japanese authorities seemed to be very eager to get rid of him. They didn't want, this is the Beatle. This is this, and also this, the irony being that this was the year during which, at the end of which, we would also lose John Lennon in December that year.
Mm.
So this, when you look back on that, that's a very poignant year that we nearly lost Paul to incarceration of a potential sentence of about 20 years to a Japanese jail. And we did lose John Lennon to an assassin. It's a surreal experience, and Paul must find that very uncomfortable to look back on. But I think it's probably highly likely that he did sabotage himself. He was using a lot of drugs at that time. His reason may have been skewed a little bit, and he might have just thought, because they'd been arrested several times before, he and Linda, and there had been trials before that. He may have just thought, this is a really easy way to get out of this tour, which I don't actually want to do anyway. I can see that.
It's such a shame because I love the final lineup, and Back to the Egg is right up there with my sort of favorite McCartney albums.
Yeah, I agree to some extent. Although if I had to choose, I would go to the earlier albums, and I would see the Zenith as being Band on the Run.
Yes, commercially and critically, I guess.
Yeah.
Congratulations on the timing of Fly Away, Paul. Perfectly timed to coincide almost with the release of Now and Then. I have to ask you about Now and Then. What are your thoughts about the song?
When I read the lyrics, I felt vindicated because I've been banging on these past few weeks about the love between Paul and John. And there is a sequence in the book where, after John was assassinated, George Martin got in touch with the presenter Andy Peebles, Radio 1 DJ, who'd just been in New York to interview John and Yoko for the release of Double Fantasy. And while Andy was on the plane returning to London, John was killed. And he didn't know about it until he got off the plane. But when he did land in Heathrow, he was dragged from pillar to post all over the place doing live interviews about John, didn't get a chance to breathe. And it was a terrible experience for him. He suffered greatly. Then he got this call from George Martin asking him to come down to the studio. Somebody wants to see you. And Andy obviously knew who it was. So he got down to Air Studios, which at that time was above Topshop on Oxford Circus.
Mhm.
And he went in, he was taken into a studio. There was a stool in the middle of the room, and Paul was sitting on it with his guitar. And as Andy entered the studio, Paul got down and he came over to Andy and they embraced. And Paul said to Andy, I just have one question for you. What was that? He said, did he still love me? And Andy said, why are you asking me that? And he said, because I never got a chance to ask him myself. And it was so important to Paul to hear that John did in fact still love him. And they'd recently, over the last few years or so, although they hadn't seen each other since 1976, after 4 years of not having spoken at all, they did regroup in 1974. They did record something together in California, which later kind of crept out, but then was withdrawn. I think that was probably Paul with his fat checkbook, just sort of taking something that was inferior off the market. But, they were in touch, and there were all the stories about Paul and Linda rocking up at the Dakota and being sent away, and that's explained in the book. That was all complicated. But here with Now and Then, we have proof, if you read the lyrics, that John loved Paul. And it's essential to our understanding of their relationship. It's amazing that we now have the technology that vocal could be extracted cleanly and then enhanced and then blended with other voices and with new instrumental sequences, and that we now have what they're calling the very last Beatles single. I wonder if there isn't other material to come, other music that they can do something with, and this won't be the end, because nobody wants it to be the end. but I think it's the perfect encapsulation of the relationship between John and Paul. And I think we're so lucky to have it.
I absolutely agree, and it's a tremendous production job as well. My only regret is there's not enough George on there.
There isn't, but there is George on there,
There
you
is
know,
George
and
on there.
given the fact that he was the one who rejected Now and Then when they were doing the Beatles anthology in the 90s, there were 3 tracks, weren't there? Free as a Bird, Real Love, Now and then George was the one who said he didn't fancy it that much, and they didn't at that time, crucially, have the tech to be able to do what they've done with it today. And that's why it's important, because it's the dawn of a new era. I know all the arguments about AI. This isn't AI, by the way. This is not even a variation of AI. It's a simulation, it's fakery. It would be creating John's voice out of nothing. That isn't what we've got here. We've got John Lennon's real voice, just cleaned up a bit. Look at all the artists that have cleaned up their act with autotune over the years. It's not that much different, is it? But anyway, we have it, and I regard it as a gift.
And Olivia has asserted that if George had still been alive, he would want it to be released. The problem that he had was not with the song, she says, but with the audio quality and the fact it was too difficult to make it work with the technology of the day.
How can we argue with her? She knew him better than anybody.
Indeed. What's your next project, Lesley-Ann?
Thank you for asking. I'm currently working on a book about Christine McVie, which is entitled Perfect, which was her maiden name.
Yeah.
And it's been an unbelievable ride, this one, because there's very little about her in the public domain. She was a quiet, modest sort of person, amazing songwriter, inspirational to the others in the band, who called her Mother Nature. Fleetwood Mac would not have been Fleetwood Mac without her, and yet she was the least visible, if in some ways the most audible, the least visible member of the band, the least scandalous, I suppose, in some ways. But she lived a life, and it's been tremendously interesting to go right back. She was born in 1943 during the war. She was born in the Lake District. Why? The family came from London, you know. So just digging through local newspapers from the 40s and 50s and piecing her life together has been so enjoyable. And I really hope to do her justice with this book.
Well,
It's my first female subject as well, by the way.
Exactly, yeah, because you've done Bolan and Bowie and Freddie Mercury, and yeah, it's interesting. Why has it taken this long?
I don't know. I think quite often a publisher will approach you. There's always a hook for a book. There's always an anniversary or some big significant date coming up. And it just happens that it's never been a female before.
Well, I can't wait to buy your book about England's very own songbird. But in the meantime, I shall content myself with reading Fly Away, Paul, and I urge everyone to go out and buy it as soon as at the earliest opportunity. Lesley-Ann, thanks very much for joining us today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.